What if I told you the next Silicon Valley won't be in California, not in New York, not in London, not in Beijing, but in one of the most overlooked, underestimated corners of the world, a place many Americans couldn't even find on a map? Burkina Faso. Sounds impossible, right? A landlocked country in West Africa, ranked among the poorest in the world, suddenly producing billion-dollar tech companies? But here's the twist. This isn't some wild prediction. It's already happening. And at the center of this unexpected revolution isn't a billionaire in a hoodie or a polished politician with Wall Street backing. No, it's a young soldier, a man who rose not from the boardroom, but from the battlefield. His name? Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could a military captain, barely in his 30s, be the face of a tech uprising? But that's exactly what makes this story so unbelievable and so important. Because Traoré isn't just building companies, he's rewriting Africa's future. And if you're in America watching this right now, you need to understand something. When Africa rises, the entire world order shifts. So let me ask you, why is nobody talking about it? Why are the headlines silent about one of the most important transformations of our time? And most importantly, what happens when this soldier's vision threatens the powers that have controlled Africa for decades? Stay with me, because once you hear what's happening on the ground in Burkina Faso, you'll never look at the world the same way again. Most world leaders are polished products of elite schools. They wear tailored suits, speak in carefully rehearsed soundbites, and have family dynasties backing them. Ibrahim Traoré? He wasn't supposed to be any of that. He was just a boy from a dusty town in Burkina Faso. No silver spoon. No billionaire father. No special privilege. What he did have was grit, and a fire that came from watching his country be exploited year after year, while his people struggled for the basics: water, jobs, safety. By the time he was a teenager, he made a decision most of us can't even imagine. He put on a uniform, picked up a rifle, and joined the army. Not because it was glamorous, because it was survival. Because somebody had to defend the land when politicians failed. And here's the crazy part. In a world where soldiers often get lost in endless wars, Traoré rose like a shadow nobody saw coming. He didn't fight for medals. He didn't fight for rank. He fought for something bigger, the idea that Burkina Faso could finally belong to its own people. Fast forward to 2022. The country is in chaos. Corruption everywhere. Terror groups cutting through villages. Foreign companies stripping resources while locals remained poor. The government paralyzed. And then, this young captain does the unthinkable. He steps forward, takes control, and promises a different future. No, he didn't sound like a polished diplomat. He sounded like what he was, a soldier who had seen enough. And that's why people listened. Because sometimes the most unlikely leaders are the ones who refuse to play by the old script. So let me ask you this. What happens when a man who never wanted power suddenly has it, and decides to use it not for himself, but to break the chains holding his entire continent back? Most soldiers think in terms of battles and borders. Win the fight, secure the land, protect the people, that's the job. But Ibrahim Traoré, he's different. He looked at his country, and he saw something deeper than war. He saw wasted potential. Imagine this: millions of young Africans, smart, hungry for opportunity, sitting with smartphones in their hands but no real digital future to plug into. While Silicon Valley and Europe raced ahead with AI, fintech, and billion-dollar startups, Africa was treated as nothing more than a market, a consumer, never a creator. Traoré said, "Why not us? Why not Burkina Faso? Why can't we build the next unicorn right here in Ouagadougou?" And this wasn't just talk. He pushed for tech hubs in cities that never had them. He invited engineers from Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, telling them, "Don't wait for permission. Build it here." He ordered investment into coding programs for rural kids who had never touched a laptop before. Suddenly, Classrooms that once had only chalkboards were buzzing with screens, software, and new possibilities. Here's the twist. While the world expected him to spend all his energy on soldiers and guns, Traoré was investing in startups and satellites. He understood something powerful. True independence isn't just about controlling borders. It's about controlling the future. Think about it. Every time you use your phone, your apps, your payments, who owns that system? In America, it's Silicon Valley. In China, it's Shenzhen. But in Africa, for decades, it was foreign companies. Traoré's vision was simple but radical. Africa would no longer rent its future. It would own it. So here's the question. What happens when a soldier starts thinking like a tech CEO? The world didn't take him seriously at first. A soldier talking about startups? That sounded like a headline, not a reality. But then, something happened. A small fintech team in Burkina Faso, barely a dozen 20-somethings working out of a garage-like office, received their first government-backed investment. They were building a payment platform designed for farmers, not bankers. Imagine this: a tomato seller in Wahiguya, or a cotton farmer near Bobo Dioulasso, sending and receiving money securely on a simple phone, not a smartphone, just a basic keypad. Within months, transactions exploded. Thousands of farmers who had been excluded from the financial system suddenly had digital wallets. Middlemen lost power. For the first time, producers controlled their own sales. And here's where it gets wild. Silicon Valley noticed. Investors from San Francisco and New York started asking, wait, what's going on in Burkina Faso? That tiny startup, once dismissed, hit a valuation nobody expected. The country that headlines had called unstable was suddenly birthing a tech unicorn. And Traoré? He didn't parade around claiming credit. He simply said one sentence that sent chills through the region. This is only the beginning. If we can build one, we can build 10. Think about that. From intercepted drug convoys to billion-dollar startups, he was shifting the entire story of Africa. But here's the real question. Why did this work in Burkina Faso and not in places with far more money, far more stability, far more support? News of Burkina Faso's first unicorn didn't stay within its borders. It detonated across Africa like a sonic boom. In Lagos, young coders whispered, if they can do it in Ouagadougou, why not here? In Nairobi, investors who once ignored West Africa suddenly began dialing Burkina Faso. And in Johannesburg, business panels debated a question they had never dared to ask out loud. Is the center of African innovation shifting north? The ripple effect was unstoppable. Young Africans, tired of being told to leave for opportunities abroad, started to believe something different. Maybe the future wasn't in London, Paris, or Silicon Valley. Maybe it was right there in the dust and sun of their own cities. But of course, not everyone celebrated. Foreign consultants raised their eyebrows. Global firms who had long dominated Africa's markets asked themselves, what if these new players refuse to sell out? What if they keep the wealth at home? That fear wasn't paranoia, it was prophecy. Because Traoré wasn't just backing companies. He was building a shield to protect Africa's tech future from being swallowed before it could even stand. And here's the hook. The unicorn wasn't the end, it was just the spark. Across the continent, whispers grew louder. If Burkina Faso can rewrite the rules, who's next? But here's the truth. Every rise invites resistance. As Burkina Faso's success story spread, the smiles in certain boardrooms began to fade. You see, for decades, Africa's role was simple: raw materials out, finished products in. Cheap labor exported, profits imported. A predictable cycle. A profitable one. For everyone except Africans. Now suddenly, under Ibrahim Traoré, that script was being torn apart. And not quietly. The birth of a unicorn in Burkina Faso was not just an economic story, it was a political earthquake. Foreign lobbyists started calling their contacts. Aid organizations began publishing concerns about sustainability. International media ran headlines that sounded like compliments but dripped with condescension. Can Burkina Faso really handle a tech boom? It wasn't just skepticism, it was pressure. Subtle, coordinated, designed to remind Burkina Faso of its place. But Traoré was not the type to bow. In fact, he leaned in harder. His message was sharp, almost defiant. Africa does not need permission to succeed. That single sentence sent shivers, both of pride across Africa and of unease in the capitals that had long considered the continent their backyard. And this is where the real battle began. Not just about apps, not just about startups, but about who controls Africa's future. But instead of retreating, Traoré turned the pressure into fuel. While critics whispered about overreach and unsustainable growth, he doubled down. He didn't just defend Burkina Faso's unicorn, he weaponized it. He turned it into proof that Africa was not only capable of playing the global game, but rewriting the rules entirely. He called on engineers from across the continent, inviting them to Ouagadougou. Coders from Lagos, data scientists from Nairobi, fintech dreamers from Accra, they all came, drawn not by money, but by something far more powerful, a chance to build history. And here's the twist that shocked the world. Traoré didn't just make it a national project. He made it Pan-African. Instead of competing against Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa, he opened the doors and said, "Let's build together. Our borders are lines on paper, but our future is one." Suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just Burkina Faso's unicorn anymore. It was Africa's unicorn. A living, breathing challenge to the old order that said Africa must remain divided and dependent. And every new download, every new user, every new partnership was like a rallying cry. Africa can rise, not as pieces, but as one. The moment Africa's unicorn went continental, the world snapped to attention. In Silicon Valley, investors who once laughed at African startups suddenly scrambled for meetings. In Europe, policymakers whispered in private briefings, "What happens if Africa stops depending on us?" And in Washington, think tanks quietly rebranded Africa from aid dependent to emerging competitor. But it wasn't just curiosity, it was fear. Because with every success story, Africa was rewriting the global balance sheet. For decades, the story was predictable. Africa supplied resources, the West supplied technology. Simple, safe, profitable. But now, the script was flipped. Africa was no longer just a supplier, it was becoming a producer, an innovator, a competitor. Headlines began to shift tone. What started as Africa's surprising tech boom quickly turned into "Is Africa about to disrupt global markets?" The language said it all: admiration on the surface, anxiety underneath. And while the boardrooms debated, ordinary people, especially the youth, felt something no foreign report could measure: hope. Real, electric hope that maybe, just maybe, Africa's future wouldn't be written by outsiders anymore. But of course, hope has enemies. And for every African celebrating this new dawn, there were powerful figures abroad asking one chilling question: how do we stop this? The resistance didn't come with tanks or soldiers. No, this was subtler, more calculated. First came the headlines. Stories planted in international outlets questioning Africa's readiness. Articles that praised progress with one hand and stabbed doubt with the other. But can such fragile systems really sustain growth? Then came the investors. Deals that once seemed promising suddenly froze. Bankers demanded impossible terms. Loans vanished in endless reviews. It was as if someone had quietly placed Africa under a glass ceiling, invisible but unbreakable. Even technology itself became a battlefield. Servers mysteriously slowed. Supply chains for key components stalled. Licensing approvals that once took weeks dragged into years. To the public, it looked like bad luck. To those watching closely, it smelled like sabotage. And yet, through it all, Traoré refused to flinch. He knew the rules of the old world. The moment Africa stands tall, pressure will come. The real question was, could his vision survive not just open enemies, but the silent daggers of hidden ones? Because here's the truth, history has shown us that empires don't surrender power willingly. They fight not with bullets alone, but with every tool of delay, doubt, and division. And just when it seemed the road was blocked, Traoré made his boldest move yet. Most leaders, faced with that kind of pressure, would have bent or quietly backed down. But not Traoré. He didn't see roadblocks, he saw proof. Proof that Africa was finally threatening the old balance of power. And instead of retreating, he stood taller. In one speech that spread across the continent like wildfire, he declared, "If our success makes the powerful uncomfortable, then we are on the right path." Those words lit a fire in the hearts of millions. Students painted them on walls. Startups turned them into slogans. And for the first time, Africa's youth felt their defiance echoed at the very top. But Traoré didn't stop at words. He took action that shocked even his critics. When foreign investors pulled out, he announced a Pan-African funding initiative, crowdfunding from the people for the people. Farmers, shopkeepers, taxi drivers, ordinary citizens invested what little they had, not for profit, but for pride. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a unicorn. It wasn't even about Burkina Faso. It became something larger, a continent-wide statement that Africa would no longer beg for validation. The unicorn wasn't just surviving the storm, it was feeding off it, growing stronger with every attempt to crush it. And the message to the world was clear. Africa was done asking. It was now demanding. At first, the world thought this was just a flicker, an outburst of energy that would burn out. But then something unexpected happened. The tide began to turn. Investors who had once backed away started creeping back in, afraid of missing out. Tech bloggers in New York and London suddenly shifted their tone, writing pieces that sounded less like mockery and more like admiration. And in global conferences, when the word innovation came up, Africa's name was no longer an afterthought, it was at the center of the conversation. But the real shift wasn't happening in boardrooms. It was happening in living rooms. Across the continent, families who had lost faith in the future began to believe again. A farmer in Ghana downloaded an app built in Burkina Faso to sell his crops directly to city markets. A student in Mali used an African-built platform to learn coding. For the first time, everyday life was changing not because of foreign aid, but because of African innovation. And here's the twist. The more the people embraced this vision, the less power outside critics had. Doubt couldn't compete with lived reality. Skepticism couldn't erase progress you could touch. The tide was no longer controlled by headlines or lobbyists. It was being driven by a force that had been underestimated for generations, the will of the people. And suddenly, what started as one unicorn in Burkina Faso looked less like a miracle, and more like the beginning of a wave. The spark in Burkina Faso didn't stay contained. It spread like wildfire. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, leaders began to ask the same question. If Burkina Faso can build a unicorn under sanctions, under doubt, under constant pressure, then what's stopping us? Suddenly, the tech hubs of Africa, Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, felt less like outliers and more like pillars of a rising empire. Startups that had been scraping for survival found new courage. Governments that once begged for foreign partnerships began drafting their own digital blueprints. And the youth, they became unstoppable. Young Africans who once dreamed of escaping to Paris, London, or New York started dreaming of building the next unicorn at home. Cafes turned into co-working spaces. University dorms became incubators. The phrase, "Made in Africa," was no longer a punchline, it was a badge of honor. And through it all, one name kept echoing across the continent, Ibrahim Traoré. To some, he was just a president. But to many, he was the symbol of a shift, a reminder that Africa's destiny wasn't written in foreign capitals, but in the hands of its own people. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso's rise. It was about an awakening, a collective realization that Africa's greatest resource wasn't gold, oil, or diamonds. It was its people, its ideas, its courage to imagine a future free from chains. And that awakening was unstoppable. The awakening wasn't just celebrated in Africa, it sent shockwaves across the globe. In Paris, analysts quietly warned, If this momentum continues, our influence in Africa will collapse. In Washington, think tanks drafted urgent reports. A digital Africa could realign global trade within a decade. And in Beijing, there was both admiration and concern, because the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just about apps or startups or technology. It was about power, economic power, political power, cultural power. For centuries, the world had grown comfortable with Africa in one role, the supplier. Now, under Traoré's vision, Africa was rewriting itself as the competitor. And competitors, as history shows, don't stay ignored for long. Suddenly, boardrooms and parliaments across the globe asked the same chilling question: what happens if Africa stops depending on us entirely? Would the price of resources skyrocket? Would Western tech giants lose their dominance? Would Africa form alliances that bypassed old powers completely? Every scenario painted one picture: a world turned upside down. And in the middle of that storm, Ibrahim Traoré stood calm, almost as if he had expected this moment all along. Because for him, the rise of Africa was not a threat to the world. It was an invitation. But the question remained, would the world accept that invitation? Or try to crush it? Every revolution reaches a crossroads. And Africa's tech awakening was no different. On one side lay the promise of unity. If the continent stood together, sharing resources, talent, and vision, it could build an economy so strong that no foreign power could dictate its future. A future where African innovation didn't just serve its people, but competed on the global stage. But on the other side lurked the oldest trap of all: division. For centuries, outsiders had used borders, tribes, and politics to fracture Africa from within. And now, with the rise of tech unicorns, the same old playbook returned. Offers of exclusive deals whispered in dark rooms. Promises of quick riches dangled before desperate leaders. All designed to splinter the movement before it became unstoppable. And here stood Traoré, not just as Burkina Faso's president, but as a voice echoing across the continent. His warning was sharp, almost prophetic. If we choose division, we return to chains. If we choose unity, we build an empire. The choice was clear, yet heavy. Because unity demanded sacrifice, letting go of old rivalries, resisting tempting bribes, and daring to trust in each other. This was no longer just about startups or innovation. It was about destiny. Africa's destiny. Would it stand as one or stumble apart? That was the question burning through every capital, every boardroom, every village. And the answer would define history itself. Just as Africa stood on the edge of unity, the shadows moved. The resistance was no longer subtle, it was surgical. Cyberattacks began striking key startups, erasing data overnight. Fake news campaigns spread like wildfire, sowing distrust between nations. Rumors whisper that some leaders were secretly negotiating with foreign powers, trading the continent's future for their own survival. It was the oldest game in the book, divide and conquer, but played with 21st century weapons. Algorithms instead of armies. Disinformation instead of gunfire. And it almost worked. Boardrooms in Lagos accused partners in Nairobi of betrayal. Investors in Johannesburg pulled back in fear. The dream of a united tech empire trembled on the edge of collapse. But then came the moment that silenced the noise. Traoré, standing before a sea of young Africans, spoke words that cut through every rumor, every doubt. The enemy is not our neighbor. The enemy is the lie that we cannot rise together. Those words hit harder than any weapon. For the youth, hungry, restless, determined, they became a shield. Suddenly, the fake headlines lost their grip. The sabotage only fueled more defiance. And the unseen enemy realized something terrifying. The more they tried to break Africa's will, the stronger it became. This wasn't just resistance anymore. It was a revolution of the mind. And then, the dawn broke. What began as one unicorn in a small West African nation had become something larger than even Traoré himself. It was a wave, a movement that no blockade, no cyber attack, no whispered deal could contain. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Children carried smartphones powered by African apps. In Nairobi, startups raised funds not from overseas, but from fellow Africans. In Lagos, engineers stopped waiting for visas and instead built futures at home. The world had no choice but to take notice. Global powers, once dismissive, now lined up at Africa's door, not to dictate terms, but to negotiate as equals. The script of history had flipped. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, not as a conqueror, but as a reminder. A reminder that Africa's strength was never in foreign approval, never in borrowed systems, but in its own people, its own vision, its own courage to dream. His final message echoed across the continent, searing itself into history. We are not the future of the world. We are the present, and the world must rise to meet us. The dawn of a new order wasn't coming. It was already here. And Africa was awake.